So, in this conversation, I'm joined by Cory House. You might know him from his courses or from his Twitter account. He's pretty active on Twitter in the React and JavaScript domain. Cory, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, for folks who don't know you, why don't we start off by a little introduction in um, to what you're doing now and your journey of getting into React and teaching JavaScript and web development and all.
Sure thing. Yeah, so I've been specializing in React basically since it was open sourced, and once it was, I just was sold on it right away. So I decided to go all in on that. I've had a consultancy now for about 7 years, full-time focused on that. So I train teams, I do workshops, and I also author courses on the topic. Often doing code reviews. I see a lot of code every day, so I'm helping companies level up their teams working in this tech in particular. And I know that's fairly specialized, but that's also what makes me useful, because I'm basically taking what I learned from a bunch of different companies and then distilling all that down for various companies so they can learn from the lessons of others along the way.
Awesome. I think first time when I came across your work was through your Twitter account and the tweets that you send out, and that's how we connected. Actually, talking to do this conversation together. But I've also seen your courses out on websites. So we're going to talk about React and React states in this conversation, so folks can have like an actual takeaway and get introduced to your work as well. But in terms of React and the journey that it has gone from, like, since it went open source and you got involved with it, all the way to now with the new changes in React and it becoming kind of a full stack library or a full stack JavaScript framework with frameworks like NextJs. I want to get your take on it compared to everything else that's going around in the industry in tech. What is your take on React, or how do you see these new changes?
So I have mixed feelings about the current state of affairs, and I say that merely because React continues to get more complicated, and that's the nature of maturity over time. It's the nature of trying to solve more problems. The upside of the whole thing is that now the React team is looking at what everybody else is doing and sort of paving the cow paths is the way that I think about it. So if you have teams that are often wanting to server-side render, making that a first-class feature that's supported makes a lot of sense. When you have people that are wanting to do optimistic updates, that's now a first-class citizen in React 19. Same things with form state and those sorts of things. So I really like that aspect of, if you're going to add complexity into React, then do so based on usage. So that they've done quite well. And I'll also say one thing that's been nice, despite the fact that over the years there's been a lot of different ways to get things done, they've done a nice job of minimizing breaking changes. So the odd thing is, like, you could rewind the clock a lot of years and go back to the days of class components. And these days it's rare to see anybody using them for new development. But in theory, you still can. It still works. They've kept the lights on there for good reason, because you've got probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of components out there that are written in the old style. And hey, why break everybody? Why force everybody to rewrite if we don't have to? So I respect that. Broadly, I'm cautiously optimistic about React Server components. I think my biggest concern right now is the framing of getting started itself when you look at the React docs, because it infers that one needs to use a framework for any new project. And depending on one's definition of a framework, I would disagree. And when I say framework, like you alluded to it, NextJS is a framework, undeniably. Now there's a grayer line, I would say, around, say, Vite. Would somebody call Vite a framework? I probably wouldn't. I'm not exactly sure what term to use for Vite, if not a framework, though, because it is. The reason I say that is it's nice to have this distinction between something that's batteries included, got everything built in. Next clearly has that. Remix clearly has that. Whereas Vite leaves some obvious things out that you're almost certainly going to need, like routing, for instance. So there's a sort of a terminology issue there, but I also just feel like it is completely relevant, completely valid to continue to consider tools like Vite for building new React apps. And it's also completely relevant to continue just to build plain old spas. And I don't feel like the React docs convey that very clearly right now. For whatever reason, it just feels like it's overemphasizing the need for using frameworks. And I do find frameworks useful, but like any tool, they have their place.
I see. Interesting take there. When thinking about server components or this new shift in React, the fact that no other framework right now has implemented server components or React server components other than Next, it makes it very limiting. So you don't have really access to the APIs outside of the framework. And you're right, a lot of apps out there may not need a full-blown framework or may just be spas, and in those cases it's a gray area. It really, there is no implementation detail in the React docs, but I think maybe in future that changes. I think NextJs was the first one to implement this alongside the React team, and that's why it kind of shifted everything towards recommending using a framework even in React docs. But I get your point. Like Vite, to me, Vite is like a build tool. Next.js is a framework, but then React itself, it's like a JavaScript library, which was like client-side before, but now it's full stack. But when you say full stack, can you say full stack without being a framework? Can you stay a library but be full stack, or are we just talking about the fact that you can run React code on the server or on the client? Doesn't matter what computer you're running it on, it's just runs on both computers. So it's a shift in the way that I, or probably folks, think about React as well. So it's an interesting time here. So as far as React goes, I know I came across one of your tweets about React State, and I know that's still a part of React that even though you have anyone who has worked with it, you might still not know all the options or not pick the right state for it. And I want to dive into that conversation, and then we will branch out as needed here and there. So why don't you take it away? And we're going to talk about different states that are available in React, from local to global, and different options that you have, and then taking us through the mental model of how you would choose what to use for what reasons.
Got it. Okay, I want to make that happen. So I'm going to shuffle my window for a second here, and then share my screen so that we can all see this. We'll share over here and go full screen. Let me make sure that when I do this, I can still see you too, because that would be helpful.
Okay.
Bingo. Okay, the stars have aligned. All right, so I want to start off just by showing this slide that I very much think about state management in React in terms of categories, and these are 8 broad categories that you think about. And I would expect anybody that's been working in React very long to recognize all of these. But the reason that I draw attention to it is really easy to make the mistake of choosing the wrong state management approach for any given piece of state. And I find most developers probably lean heavily toward use state, which is a wonderful tool. It's very versatile. And as far as a default goes, I think it's very reasonable for that to be a logical default. But because of that, it leads to a set of problems, one of them being people forgetting about the URL in particular. So I really emphasize the URL as a state management system because it's so easy to overlook. Also web storage, that again, with the browser there, we have to remember that these tools that are not tied to React at all are still right there at our disposal, and they're often the right option. I mean, you rewind the clock back to when I was working in jQuery. I remember I felt like we used the URL more, and I think part of the reason we did was it was just so top of mind that we were thinking more about using the platform and less about using a JavaScript library. So that, I think, encouraged me to use the right tool more often. I also want to point out here that, I show these 8 different ways, but you'll notice that some of these are more patterns than they are actually state persistence approaches, for instance. So lifting state is a pattern. It's a pattern of basically cutting and pasting. But I emphasize that simply to say that sometimes the right tool is not even to have to declare new state. It's using existing state that you see somewhere else that merely needs lifted up to a common parent. And an idea very closely related to this is the idea of derived state, which is I use a calculator as a logo here merely because the idea is to derive state from some other state. So the common mistake is if you are in a situation where you find that you could answer a question using existing state, then it's best to derive that state rather than to declare another piece of state. And one can do that as simple as setting a variable and then just calculating some values. So a very trivial example of this is if I'm storing a first name and a last name, I want to avoid having another piece of state called full name. I would derive the full name from the first and the last name. Or if I have an array of products, I would want to avoid having a piece of state that stores the number of products because that number of products can be derived from the length of that array. So derived state is not technically complicated, but it is something that is easy to overlook.
Another example that just came, sorry to interrupt you there.
Sure.
Another example that just came to my mind is and it's very typical when you have a list of products and then you want to filter them based on a search query, and then you have another state. Instead of having another state and use effect to then look at the search query and then hold a state for the filtered ones, you just derive that state from the original array of products combined with the search query.
Exactly. Yes. Anytime that I can avoid a use effect, I'm happy. That's a side note. I increasingly feel like if use effect's the answer, I'm probably asking the wrong question, is very much the way I feel about it. It's easily the most overused API in React, and it also has a lot of potential misuses. And these days also it's just largely unnecessary given all the good abstractions that can call use effect on my behalf instead.
Yeah.
So that's a great point.
There's a part in React docs. When I saw it, I don't know when I saw it, but I realized, there's a lot of times that you don't need use effect. There's the part is about you probably don't need use effect. Mm-hmm. So exactly for what you're saying here. Okay, awesome. So we have some local state, some derived state. There are some patterns here in the list. I'm glad you mentioned URL because that ties into the way we are doing React right now, more with server components, because URL is the exact place to communicate between client and server. But very interesting stuff here in terms of web storage, local state, third-party global context. So let's dive a bit more into these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you think about all this is the high-level category, but what I actually want to show is if we go a little bit farther, there's just a silly number of ways to handle state. And I like to show this just merely to draw people's attention to options that they may not have ever considered before. So built-in state, people are going to be familiar with use state, user-reducer, user-f, been around a long time. But with React 19 coming soon, we've got use optimistic, which is useful, use action state. So use optimistic is for optimistic updates. Use action state was recently called use form state, but has been recently renamed. So if you're dealing with forms, you're probably going to find use action state useful. And one of the nice things you're going to get from that is graceful degradation. So the form will submit even if JavaScript hasn't parsed yet. So if somebody clicks submit really quickly, for instance, it'll still work. And then I also just point out here that React Server components are effectively a state management system because they eliminate the need for state altogether. I love this, that I can query for some data and then just return some JSX. I never actually had to go take that data and put it into state in any way. I just render based on that. So it is, I think about React Server Components almost as a state management alternative, if you will, because otherwise I would have to have state on the client so that I could render on the client when that state completes or when that state is fetched, for instance. So there is some nuance there because there's third parties that can also do that for me, and we'll look at those here in a second. So the web platform I was alluding to on the previous slide too, but just keep in mind there's a lot of options there. And again, this section I think tends to be underutilized by React developers because we tend to think in terms of what does React do instead of what does the platform support. So worth looking at these. General state management systems. I really like these, although these also, these are sort of the opposite problem of the web platform. General state management, when we talk about things like Redux or Zustand or Jotai, these tend to be overused. And the reason that they're overused is, in my experience, anytime that you have a global state option, people tend to treat it like a junk drawer. They start putting everything in there because it's just convenient. It removes a set of decisions. Maybe I'll want to access it somewhere else later. But that's generally undesirable. Ideally, we want to try to keep state as local as we can. And the other thing is, if you're using focused third-party state management systems, which I'm going to talk about here in a moment, those tend to be preferable to these general state management solutions. So let's talk about some specific state management tools. Remote state like TanStack Query, SWR, Apollo, RTK Query. These are all great ways to handle state that you fetch from a server. And once you use these, those general state tools tend to be still useful, but only for a minority of cases, for the rare state that isn't remote state. So that's why I say they tend to often be overused. I often look at clients who have Redux, for instance, and they're using Redux, say, for form state, and it doesn't make sense because form state doesn't need any global manifestation. It is tied to a single component. Then you have route state, which is all about storing your state in a particular URL route rather than in a particular component. And this is an interesting area, which is still growing, but you can do this with Remix. You can do this with TanStack Loader or React Router. And then finally, there's form state and lots of form libraries out there. My controversial opinion is that you generally don't need these. They're nice, they're useful, they can be helpful, but I tend to find that I can create my own patterns, my own components, and I enjoy that pretty well. But I will say I've enjoyed using React Hook Form. I found Formic useful in the past as well, so they're worth considering. So that's 30 different ways to handle state, and some people look at this as a concern, as a sign that React is complicated. I look at this as a wonderful thing. I love having all these options. I love the maturity of the ecosystem. I like that there's different approaches for different preferences and different circumstances. So I see this as a win. So I'll pause for a second there. Any insights on that?
That's great. Actually, it's really interesting. Unless you look at it on a page like this, you don't realize all of these different options and how I love how you categorize them in different ways, from the built-in APIs in React to APIs in the browser to third parties to remote state fetching and then managing your state using the libraries like SWR or TanStack Query. The route state that's actually interesting for the routers that we have, and then the form state. Probably if you have asked me to name all the states available, I would have been able to come up with 10, not all of them. It's interesting to look at it from this perspective.
It's also interesting because this is not an exhaustive list. I just basically stopped at the point that I thought, okay, these are the most popular options here, but man, they're like, just even if you talk about Redux, there's a lot of alternatives to Redux, and I put the most popular one in here which is Zustand, which I really enjoy, but all of these have competitors that
Yeah.
create a long
And
list.
I like something that you mentioned in the beginning of this slide, and that's looking at React Server Components as a state management tool, because it literally removes the need for you to have states, because your server, or you're moving the state to the server now, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And then in combination with the URL, you can communicate or hold the state that's shared now between the server and the client. So basically with your React Server Component and URL, and some of the new hooks in React 19, such as maybe the use hook that allows you to resolve a promise on the client side, it removes a lot of need for any kind of state, especially the third-party ones, which are bigger and in most cases unnecessary, the general state thingies, unless you are, I don't know, maybe a non-frequently changing state globally, like a theme or something that you would probably use, like use context or something. I feel like personally in my recent projects, less and less need for general state management like Zustand. Before I used to use Zustand in almost every React application. Now I don't reach for it. Do you feel like that as well, or am I?
Yeah, I feel
wrong?
the same.
Yeah.
I find the only real time that I would consider using Zustand these days is situations where I formerly would have used React's context. And I don't use context very often, but I do prefer Zustand's API. It gives me more granularity around performance optimizations, and it also just feels less, it feels a little more elegant than the built-in context API. But to your point, once I moved over to using tools like TanStack Query or Apollo to handle remote state, there's just not that much state left that would warrant any kind of global concerns. I will say there's one other place that I found tools like Zustand or Jotai useful, which is when I have state that I want to be able to access outside of React altogether. That's pretty useful. There was a case I had the other day where I needed some state to interact with a third party before React was even rendering to the screen. So that meant I needed some global state there, and this was partially related to displaying errors as well, potentially, and capturing those that could happen before the React app is actually rendered. So having that data within a third party like Zustand ended up being quite useful there. But you're right, it's a small fraction of the state management this time. So that's why I say those tend to be overused, unlike the web platform features, which tend to be underused. So there's mistakes that can happen on either side.
Got it.
Okay, so I showed these 30. The other thing I wanted to be sure that we showed was just a flow chart, because I have a flow chart that I spent a lot of time just thinking through how to pick a state approach, and I laid this out in a flow chart, and I think talking it through will help. And I want to emphasize that at the top of this flow chart, I very deliberately put URL. Is it shareable via the URL? Because this is the one that's so easy to overlook. And if it is shareable, then put it in a URL. So this emphasizes, here's the way I think about it. If I grab the URL at any point in time while I'm using my application and I share it with you, will you see the same thing? And if the answer is no, that's a bad sign. It doesn't necessarily mean I made a mistake, but it's at least a smell that I should probably consider putting it in the URL. So things like the current page, what my current search is, my pagination, my filtering, whatever tags I might have turned on, whether an accordion is open or shut, whether a modal is open or shut, all these things could be stored in state, but if I put it in the URL, then it assures that you and I see the same thing, and that's a win. So if it's not shareable via the URL, then I ask, okay, is it something that I fetched? And if it's fetched and for multiple routes, then I use some kind of a remote state library like TanStack Query, which is my favorite. Whereas if it's just tied to a single route, then I might consider using some kind of a route state instead, such as TanStack Router, which has support for loaders, or Remix, those sorts of tools. So those are caching at the route level rather than in a global cache that's keyed. If it's not fetched, then I start asking, okay, so for how many components? Well, if it's shared state, then there's nothing wrong with passing props. And I want to emphasize, I feel like the term prop drilling has probably created needless drama around this idea that people have this aversion to passing props because some people feel like, okay, if I'm passing props from parent to child, now maybe that's a sign I should not pass the props. Maybe I should use context, or I should use some third-party library. I don't see anything wrong with passing props a few levels. In fact, that's exactly why they exist. So that's, to me, an obvious choice. The real gray line here is, how does one define prop drilling? So I'm curious how you'd answer it. Like, how many layers would you drill before you go, uh-oh, this feels like too much?
I would generally go, if it is like 3-4 levels, I'm usually okay, like maybe 3 levels. If it is more than that, I'll be like, okay, this is probably something that I need to lift up or maybe share it. Like on a higher level or globally. But what I'm finding myself now more and more using React Server components in the context of Next.js is very, very minimal prop drilling, because I fetch whatever data that I need in server components where I need it, and maybe I just need to pass it down one like prop down, and that has been it. For everything else, such as themes or context for the auth, it's just using either the library, like you mentioned, or context, React context. So I don't find myself drilling props that much recently.
That resonates with me too. I agree. It's especially if you're lucky enough to be working in React Server components, it dramatically reduces the chance that you're going to need to do that sort of thing. So,
yeah.
And what you said about 3 or 4, in my experience, most people sort of have that sense of it too. Usually somewhere between 3 and 6 components where you go, okay, I'm clearly drilling at this point. I should consider context or Zustand or Jotai. Or perhaps a global cache type setup, which I'd get from a remote state tool.
Exactly. And I like how you started with the URL there. That's an interesting take, because as React developers, at least back in the days, we would never think like this. Nowadays, because of the server components, we do, or I tend to do, but we never think of shareable state via URL. In fact, the example that you made about sharing your link to somebody else, and if they would see exactly what you see, most React applications is not built like that. So it's just internal state. You share the link, they just go in the beginning of the application, it has nothing to do with the state you are in. And it's only, at least my use of it heavily now is because of the React Server components, to realize, hey, this is the state that we can have up in the URL. I remember back in the days, I would do the same stuff with the router state and try to just use the router when I wasn't using Next.js and I was using React Router. It gives you the URL. It's basically managing your URL state. And I was like, okay, so whatever I can manage with React Router, which is basically the URL state, that's it. That's the state. You don't need any extra state. But then now with the server components, that there is no like a React Router library or state manager. It's just literally the URL. It just makes me think, okay, this is just a piece of state that's just persistent. My client has access to it. My server has access to it. So if you can use it there, that's the best place. And that's the first step in your diagram here, which isn't the way that most of React developers think.
I agree. It's not. And that's precisely why I put it at the top too. I thought about this and I thought, where do I need to begin to draw attention to the fact of what should probably be the default? And it surprised me over time how I found more and more that I would be just fine putting all sorts of different state in the URL. I mean, one can even do that for form state in some cases. And there's some advantages to doing so, because I could have a partially completed form and I could send it to someone else and they could have their form populated based on that query string. So that may or may not be useful, but it is, again, something to consider. And by putting it at the top, I help draw attention to it. And yeah, I do agree with you. With React Server components are really encouraging thinking about the URL more too, because of that shared state aspect with the server and the client, that I've got this settings in between. And yeah, that can be quite useful. So hopefully that helps lift all boats.
Absolutely. So, and then the next step we have the fetched versus not, whether or not we need it across multiple routes. In that case, we could share it like in SWR, React Cory, or TanStack Cory. And then if not, the route state, which is the React router, or if it's not fetched, okay, so we are down in this branch. So if it is not fetched, it's local. Is it local? How many components do they need it? Shared state, or if it is shared between many components, I'm assuming that you would either lift it up or share it globally.
Yeah, and this is where I could toss in some more options here. So if it is not fetched state, but it is for many components, then passing props is the obvious option at first, but that doesn't scale as we talked about it. So you might consider context. You could consider local storage or a cookie or IndexedDB, or all sorts of global state management tools like Redux, Justand, Recoil, Jotai, MobX, Valtio, Xstate. So much in this space, so many options with this whole idea of shared state. But again, this is less necessary than it used to be for a number of reasons, partially because remote state has gobbled up so much of our state management, and also because in a world of React Server components, this is less necessary too. You just find yourself passing props less often. You fetch what you need on the server, and then the cache handles that. So the shared state area is actually an area where there's tons of options, but I actually see it as less necessary and probably less popular in 2024, and especially as we move more people to React Server components. So if it's not for many components, then the next question I ask is it for a form? And if so, then I consider form state. And I want to emphasize, when I talk about form state, okay, I'm completely fine with using just use state or use reducer. But yes, I might consider a form library. My take is that what you really need is a form pattern, and you can implement your own form patterns doing a combination of some custom hooks and some components that make this easy. Because you look at what any form library is, that's largely what it is. It tends to be some custom hooks that have certain opinions there. And if those opinions happen to match yours, then great. I tend to find forms are weird in every application in a different way. So sometimes it's nice for me to just create my own abstractions there, because with React hooks, it's nothing more than reusable logic. So something to consider. And as a side note, in one of my Pluralsight courses called Managing React State, I show this exact setup where we create a form using just plain React, and I emphasize that a lot of the state can be derived rather than stored in state. So even something that you wouldn't think, like errors, form errors do not require state. Because if you think about it, I can tell you whether the form has an error based on what value someone has entered and whether the form has been submitted, or whether the fields have been blurred, whether they are dirty effectively. So I can derive my errors from that other information, and therefore I don't have to store errors in state. And that's a win, because it means that then I don't have to worry about my errors getting out of sync with the form state itself. And effectively, the less state that I have, the less state sync issues I'm likely to have. So that's the win there.
I like that take on using native APIs for React to manage your forms. And almost every time that I used to write state for forms, I think the loading and error state is something that you just write out of habit. But you're right. For errors, you can just drive it from the state of the input or whatever is happening around that. I usually now recently I find myself using React Hook forms a lot because in most cases it's suitable for what I'm doing. It just ties into validation tools like Zod, and then I hook up my forms with actions in NextJs. So more and more I find myself just using React Hook forms, especially because it's more optimized and not renders the forms on every state change. But if I want to have a more custom form or something that's not kind of fitting into this API, I'll then use the hooks and APIs to build my form. But for most majority of cases, I'm just reaching out to React Hook forms.
Yeah, and that is a good call out, that React Hook form makes it easy to create uncontrolled components, which one can do on their own. It's just, it's tedious to do on your own and potentially error prone because you're to some degree fighting against the nature of React itself. Like React is basically designed to say, when state changes, I'm going to re-render. So the moment that we go down the uncontrolled form route, now it's my job to make sure that the right data is displaying on the page at the right time. I could potentially be manipulating DOM, and that runs against the traditional React mental model. So React Hook form does a nice job of creating uncontrolled forms for me in an easy manner, in an opinionated way. So I do like that. It's just, I will say that to me, the primary reason that I would consider uncontrolled forms at all is for performance reasons. And I tend to find that I don't have form performance issues. And in the rare cases that I do, it's usually because the form has gotten too long anyway. So users tend to not want a form that has dozens of fields. They want a form that has a small number of fields, and then I might click next so that I can persist those changes. So I work through in stages so I don't risk losing my work, and I also don't feel overwhelmed by a page that might have 50 or 100 different fields. If there's that many fields, I probably want to break it down into steps, at which point now there's less rendering on every keystroke. So different ways to solve that problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll just close out on this flowchart with the last thing here. If it's not related to a form, then what we're talking about is plain old state, and usually use state or use reducer are going to be the way to go. I tend to use state most of the time, but it did surprise me. I did a poll recently on Twitter and found the vast majority of developers in React do not use reducer, and many hadn't used it at all, which is a little odd. I find it as a useful tool, but honestly, it is, in many cases, there's this sort of feeling of overkill. It is nice that you can unit test it in isolation, though. So it does feel like, to me, I would say it's probably a little bit underutilized, but it is certainly a trade-off, though. I disagree with people that say basically go use reducer because it's definitely more powerful. It's just a better version of useState. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's better. I'd say it's a trade-off in developer experience, and it does offer some benefits in testability. And then I'll also just mention in here XState briefly, that XState is powerful and compelling, but in most cases, it's a bit like cutting paper with an axe. It can do it, but it's overkill for most purposes. So I think about it like if you think you need XState, you're probably feeling a huge amount of pain about the amount of complexity about all your different workflows and transitions between all these different states. In those cases, XState is wonderful because it can enforce those transitions. But if you don't have those sorts of problems, then it just feels a little bit too heavy to justify.
Overkill. Yeah, that's my general feel about XState too. I felt like it's an overkill for most of the stuff unless you're, as you mentioned, managing a whole complicated interrelated state. Now, about use reducer, you're right. A lot of people don't use it. Sorry. And I feel like what has made it more complex is just I think, or at least this is how I came across it. The way folks learn use reducer is by applying the same patterns that they learned in Redux. So they use the same mental model of defining your dispatch actions and stuff, which makes it bloated and more complicated. But I remember back in the days, I was reading a book on React that I have it here. Let me see if I can reach it. It's this book by Yves Porcello and Alex Banks. I had Yves as the first guest on the podcast here. They had an amazing way of explaining use reducer, which was in its most simple way of using it without the crazy boilerplate of just basically repeating Redux type code in use reducer. And that made the click for me to understand, oh, this is just as easy as use a state. Actually, you can turn any user state into using this, and it's not that complicated. I think what made it complicated for folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the way that we all learned, or we see on tutorials that people use, like with a bloated code of and dispatchers and stuff, that makes it a bit harder.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I agree with you that people obviously associate it with Redux because I think Redux inspired the fact that it exists at all. I don't believe we'd have use reducer if we didn't have Redux previously. So, yeah, there was a time I was a big fan of Redux. These days I just look at those sorts of things and it just feels bloated compared to the way that I might use, say, Zustand and just, I want to invoke a function. I prefer the simplicity of that over having to dispatch actions. But I recognize that's also it's a bit of a stylistic issue. There's some trades there. It is certainly nice that you can pass the dispatcher down though, and its identity remains stable. So there's some performance optimizations that you get for that too.
Exactly. Awesome. Okay, so this was a very nice mental model or steps of deciding which one of these many states is probably more suitable for what you're trying to do, driving it here. Now, you mentioned you have a course on React State on Pluralsight. Mm-hmm. What other courses do you have or are you actively working on? Any new course? And what other courses do you have?
Just a few weeks ago, I published a course on third-party state in React, and I focused in particular on some of the shared state options and then remote state options. So it's an interesting course because I contrasted Zustand and Redux and Jotai, MobX, Valtio, a few of these shared state tools so that people could understand how to pick between them, what the trade-offs are on them. And then I was also just pretty candid about some of my preferences. I really like Zustand and Jotai in particular off of that list. But it's funny too, like my most popular course on Pluralsight for many years has been Redux. And I think that's partially because Redux itself is the most popular of everything I listed there. And it's funny because, you rewind the clock years ago, there was a time that I was really excited about Redux. These days, I'm not as much so because I just think better alternatives have come out and we have less and less need for dedicated shared state libraries. But in that course, my goal was just to show a lot of different ways to handle state using third parties. And the other thing that I emphasize is just how powerful it is to have a remote state library. So I walk through TanStack query in there, but I also talk about some of the other alternatives. The other thing that I would just emphasize though is there is plenty that you can get done with just plain React. I certainly don't feel like you have to pull in a ton of libraries these days. They are there. They're worth considering, but it's not like you always need them. The only thing that I would almost lean toward saying always about is a remote state library, simply because React itself doesn't do a great job with remote state. It doesn't give you any very useful primitives. If you're using useEffect raw, then you've got a lot of well, you just have a bad developer experience and you've got a lot of edge cases to think about. So you can end up creating custom hooks to get around some of those things, but you're really reinventing the wheel at that point. And since pretty much every application does fetch data, it's useful to have some kind of a remote state library there. So that's the only darn near always that I would say in this conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that called there with SWR or TAN stack query. You get the data fetching, you get the state management, you get the data revalidation, you get the mutation. So it gives you a full array of management so that if you were to implement all of that yourself, it would be, you're basically better off using these if you're fetching data remotely. And you're right. I usually use SWR, and I like the fact that you can just mutate data. It's just the same idea of what server actions are doing now in NextJS, handling this API route for you to mutate data and then revalidate the data, which is what these libraries were doing. It's just that it's on the client side. So I happen to use these as well. I never maybe thought about them as a state management tools. That's why when I'm talking to folks, I'm like, I don't use state that much now that I'm using server components, but these are state management tools. I thought about them more like data fetching libraries, but they're basically managing that data that's being fetched, revalidating that data, mutating that data. So it's good to think about them as also a state management tool. It's just that the data is remote and you're just fetching it.
Exactly. Totally agree.
Awesome. Okay, so that was a deep dive. Anything left in your slide?
Those were the core topics that I was wanting to discuss in here, but happy to chat about anything else that you might think of.
That was a deep dive into React State. I liked it, the detail that we covered, different states and the logic of when to pick what. We talked about your courses. We're going to include links in the description for folks to check your work out and to your Twitter account. So anything else about the React State that you want to cover?
I think that is the keys for me. Yeah, I could go a lot farther down different paths, but I kind of like where we left it here. This feels like a good stopping point to me.
Okay, awesome. So maybe we can stop sharing the screen.
There we go.
Awesome. So before I let you go, I also want to get your take on the new developments in AI and how you're seeing the scene from that perspective, with tools now popping out every month, either writing code or helping developers in code. What is your take on it, or the future of our jobs as developers?
I just recently recorded a show with a friend of mine who has a master's degree in AI and is doing AI research. He has a opinion that's similar to mine. That's this mixture of optimism and dread. And I am vacillating between the two. Today, I'd say it's more dread than optimism, simply because there's just some things that I've seen recently as far as the amount that a single person can get done is amazing. And the amount that somebody can accomplish with less of a focus on syntax and more of a focus on communication, that makes me wonder what my career looks like in a few years. And I'm genuinely concerned about it. Like I'm having an existential crisis of sorts, because I take my career pretty seriously, and I've got like this pile of books behind me that I've read over the last 20 years. And a lot of that is about how to communicate to a computer using syntax. And I think that idea may be going away, which sounds bizarre. Not fully, but in many cases. So in that world, there's a whole set of things that shifts, and it makes me wonder if I'm focused on the right things. For instance, should I focus more on prompt engineering, on communication skills, on thinking entrepreneurially and trying to build products while these AI tools are still in their infancy and a lot of people don't realize how dang powerful they are? It's weird. And I don't know if I also have optimism though, because I love the idea that humanity's future could be talking to a computer in plain English and having it accomplish what they want. I think if humanity can have that, then humanity by definition is wealthier than we are today. And I do think about wealth as an infinite pie. It's not like one person getting wealthy makes someone else poorer, because wealth is just merely things people want. And if everybody can have the software that they want by telling a computer what they'd like it to do, that's winning. That's a win for humanity. But it may be a loss for me wanting to pay my bills. That's the question.
Yeah, I like your take on it. It's more so how to position yourself in this new change, because it's a big change and it's very powerful. It can have positive effects on us all, but from the perspective of a developer and educator, maybe the best question that you brought up is thinking about how to position yourself to help to use this. Is it that you need to build a tool now? Is it that is it that you need to maybe create a business? Is it the startup? Is it for me on a day-to-day basis doing my job, AI is empowered me to just do more on my own. I don't know if you have tried Cursor or not, but it's amazing, and it just enables me to just do more of what I'm doing. At this point, it's still, for me, it's not reliable enough to just let it build something, but it just empowers me when I'm using it. We may reach a point where it gets so powerful that you can just talk or communicate in English and then get a software out. But even then, I'm thinking of how to position ourselves with this new change, because there's going to be, just like you mentioned, new type of jobs like prompt engineering being one, or designing these AI systems or AI agents to work with one another to then create a powerful tool. I think with every change in technology, there's going to be some jobs that change, some jobs that are going to just be removed, but then new type or kinds of jobs are going to emerge. And us as developers we're just problem solvers. There's going to be new problems to solve, I'm sure, and probably we need to focus on maybe different sorts of problems.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think you do a good job of pointing out the optimistic side of thing too. And you are right. Like we aren't paid for code. We're paid for solutions. We're paid for solving problems. And there is seemingly an infinite number of problems remaining to be solved in the software space. Yes, we've scratched a lot of itches, but we're far from any company having the software that they truly desire if they could just snap their fingers and say that it would do this.
Exactly. Let's keep optimistic, keeping optimistic about this. Cory, it was nice talking to you. It was nice having you here. Great depth of knowledge about React and State. Thanks for sharing that with us. For anyone who wants to check Cory's work, we're going to include links in the description. He has amazing courses. Maybe we're going to have him back for a part 2 follow-up to this conversation. Maybe as React 19 comes out and some of the APIs matures out, we're going to have Cory back for another conversation. So thank you very much for joining me, Cory.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. Okay, folks, so that's a wrap for this conversation. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.